snowstorm to get here. So we have people who come from Albany and people who were in New York, and of course, Southern Cayuga County. And that was then it was, of course, the first person in who's here this morning. So, with your permission, we're going to go about 5 minutes after 9 to allow our speakers to have the allotted time, and those of you who have to leave, we understand. I had this all planned out that we would have a mail soundtrack about how tough it is to get a connection in Southern Cayuga County. I'm trying to get Dan fired up because I know he has been looking forward to this never. He tells me stories about how tough it is to get a connection where he lives, and I'm not picking on you because you're my friend, but I know how frustrated you are about this. And so the Wednesday Morning Roundtable has been talking about this subject for about 2 or 3 years. It originally started as a blueprint, original item, and we would say, I think Jesse would agree, of the 7 original blueprint items, this is the one item that was not accomplished. Working on the hospital, working on downtown, education, all those items, job training, CETA through economic development, everything that was on that list had broad support and wide support to get things done. Broadband and Wi-Fi in Cayuga County and in Auburn has been a challenge for a lot of different reasons. One has been expense, one has been technology that has continually evolved. We had a city manager, not Doug Selby, who said, you know, if I invest in technology today, it's done tomorrow, and I don't know that I can justify it to the council. And so over time, it's been a challenge. So what we talked about at the Wednesday Morning Roundtable, the executive committee, was the idea that there are changes that are occurring, and in the last year and a half, there have been massive changes. The first has been what has been going on in Southern Cayuga County, and that's why we have Keith Batman here. And I'm not going to give abbreviated biographies because of time, but he was a town supervisor in Scipio with many other towns in the southern part of the county, as well as northern Tompkins, that put a consortium together to deal with the issues of rural connections, which has been a problem in our, not only in our schools, but in the agricultural community. Last year, the governor appointed a 3-person committee to look at education and connectedness, and that has been, Constance Evelyn was one of the only representatives from upstate, but she also represented education. She's been the superintendent of schools for several years and was a big supporter of, though she was very clear not to campaign for it, because she was in the campaign mode in November, but to support the $2 billion bond act, one of the few bond acts that have passed in New York State over the last several years, most of the last 2 decades, and that was passed by the voters, including in largely upstate rural New York, where traditionally voters had voted against bond acts. It passed. And then we're going to finish off with what we have been hearing a lot about, and that's David Salway, who came in from Albany to talk about the governor's new initiative. The governor, in his State of the State, he may have, and something tells me he got this beautiful slide. He showed a slide of the map of the state of New York, and if it was it yellow? If it was yellow, it didn't have coverage, and most of New York, after you got above Yonkers, was yellow, with some small pieces. And so the governor has put together several proposals. They still have to, as we understand it, get passed by the legislature, which is working this week and next week on known as the Big Ugly, to get a budget passed. But it will be for 2019 to have broadband and internet in upstate New York and throughout the state for an economic development reasons and whatnot. They said on this particular initiative, if the governor has any legacy, it may be this. Just as the great endeavors of the last 200 years, where we've had things from the highway system and the Erie Canal, this could be a real game changer for New York. So with that as a setup, we're going to go in the order of their presentations. We're going to have Keith Batman talk to you a little bit about what went on in Southern Cayuga County and Northern Tompkins, then switch over to Constance Evelyn, and then finish up with Mr. Salway, and then go to Q&A. So, Mr. Batman, well, thank you.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, nice of you to come out. So, of course, I want to thank Guy and the Roundtable for inviting me here. I've been asked to speak about the efforts, particularly in Southern Cayuga County, to bring broadband to our rural communities. So let me share some history, and then along the way maybe interject some observations and thoughts. About 7 years ago, the people in Scipio, Genoa, and Niles started looking at options to bring broadband to our communities. We did this independently. Well, after we began, not long after we began, we realized that the other communities were involved, and so we combined our efforts and began working together. We began our effort by reaching out to some providers. And we reached out to many providers. In my and probably our collective naivete, we kind of assumed and thought that if we offered a public-private partnership, if we offered to do marketing, if we offered to maybe do some training of the public, we would find many providers that were interested in partnering with us. Well, that's not the way it is. Which brings me to my first principle that I want to leave you with today. If the provision of high-speed, affordable, available internet was a sound business opportunity, it would already be done. It's not. It simply is not a viable alternative. It simply is too expensive to serve me and my neighbors without financial incentives and support. So, we continue to look, to talk, to research. Something we realized quite early, and something that grows out of my first principle, is what you might term the Three Musketeer philosophy. That's all for one and one for all. So my second principle to leave you with today is that rural internet has three components: speed, access, and affordability. First, speed. It must be capable to carry the load of 21st century virtual interchange and work. Access. It must be universally, or as close as we can come to universally accessible. And affordability, it must be priced in a way that allows everyone to participate. Without these three pillars, we risk creating yet another cultural, economic, and social division of the haves and have-nots in our society. This could also be termed the utility principle. We need and want internet capability in our communities that parallel what we expect from electric service. What do we expect from electric service? We expect that capacity is able to meet our needs, not the needs of 1950 rural America. We expect everyone to have access to electricity. And we expect that our electric rates will not prohibit our less affluent neighbors from affording access. This is the same with internet. But back to the story. Sometime around mid or late 2009, we settled on Clarity Connect as the provider with whom we would work. Now, this decision was complicated, technical, and certainly beyond this morning's discussion. Not really. The fact is, Clarity Connect was the only provider that was interested in working with us given the utility principle: speed, access, and affordability. Some were willing to work with us to serve some of the more settled pockets in our communities, areas in which the number of households per mile, per acre, per length made it attractive. And in fact, during the time we were working, some service was expanded in Niles, Scipio, and Genoa. But no one other than Clarity Connect was willing to embrace the utility principle. And it didn't hurt that they were already working with groups in Tompkins and at that time some other counties. So we supported Clarity in an application for federal stimulus funds that included communities in Cayuga, Tompkins, Broome, and some other counties. It was a large application. It was a solid application. And we thought probably had a good chance. Well, it wasn't solid enough, and it wasn't funding. Well, what we later discovered is my third principle, and that is this. We are unlikely to score well in any national competition for broadband funds, for no matter how bleak we may see our options for service, we do not fare well in the competition of have-nots compared with many other regions and states, particularly in the West. On a national scale of internet poverty, we simply are not the poorest of poor. So our hope rests locally, regionally, and with New York State. And by the way, we are lucky to have a governor who who recognizes the importance of broadband, as David will talk about. So this brings us to 2012, or at least I think that's the year. I lose track of time. Clarity Connect is the lead for-profit partner applied for a grant in collaboration with communities in northern Constance and southern Cayuga counties. Hurricane Sandy intervened and the award announcements were postponed. But in March 2013, we learned that the application had been successful. Hooray. While no formal written confirmation was received according to Clarity, they did have verbal assurance that work could begin, and they did so in Tompkins County. Now, they began in Tompkins because the needed agreements were all in place there, and there was still some work to be done in Cayuga. The build-out continued for about the next year or so, and at this point, most of the Tompkins infrastructure is actually in place. In this build-out, according to Clarity, they borrowed their limit, and must await the flow of the federal or the state grant funds in order to continue. So the work to date then is largely in Tompkins County. This does not mean, however, that no one in Cayuga County is getting service. Clarity's technology is a radio technology which sends a line-of-sight signal. What this means is that current portions of Genoa and Ledyard along the west portion along the shores of Cayuga Lake are getting service at this time. But still, most of us in Cayuga County are without service. So for us, there have been a series of delays. The initial grant was cut from 2.2 to 2.9 million, which meant that some areas in both Cayuga and northern Tompkins counties were eliminated from coverage. Delay number one. Some additional funds became available, and Clarity submitted an application to use some of these funds to cover some of the uncovered areas. And this application, considered as part of the initial grant, required a new review and a new public hearing. That put the grant on hold temporarily. Well, this public hearing was not held until April 2014. The Cayuga County commitment had to be rethought, rediscussed, re-researched, and our commitment renegotiated and reconfirmed. This resulting in yet more delay. These grants are reimbursement grants. That is, as we would think about the process, you do the work, you collect your bills, you submit them, and you get reimbursed. There was some confusion and problems initially, and some complication of paperwork I'm not entirely familiar with, but it had to be resubmitted. That is, Clarity had resubmitted. So one more delay. However, at this point, as I understand it, the paperwork is in, the reimbursement in process. Oh, but New York State has a policy of withholding reimbursements for 6 weeks to 3 months. So there's might be a little delay there. So, at this point, though, I'm hoping that funds will flow by the end of April, that work begins and is completed, I hope, by this fall. But I'm not saying this in public because I've been hopeful before, been disappointed. And we're not in public here, right?
Don't worry about the camera. We're not filming anything, don't worry.
That being the case, I think my right to deniability, just in case there is a delay that makes these dates unworkable. So this is where we are. It's been a long time, and it's still not complete. I remain hopeful, however, that this is an example of the old saying that good things come to those who wait. And wait. And wait. This is a great project, and it's a true collaboration. In fact, the project was awarded recognition for collaboration from Mr. Salway's group and the governor. The project will reach more than 90% of the homes in our service area. It provides for reduced fees for families whose children are on free and reduced lunch program. It brings together towns, counties, a number of state agencies, all in service to our residents. And the contributions are not just letters of support. The towns and counties are contributing several hundreds of thousands of dollars, as well as hundreds of thousands of dollars in in-kind support. And both Tompkins and Cayuga County are allowing access to their 911 towers. moving parts have been the biggest challenge, however. A principle of mechanics is that the more moving parts, the more wear. And the more wear, the more chance of failure. I'm beginning to think, and I haven't thought this through, but I'm beginning to think that there is such a thing as too much collaboration. The move today is to have multiple partners, each demonstrating their commitment with the contribution of resources. Well, there's a lot to be said for that. However, it introduces multiple bureaucracies, multiple rules, procedures, and processes. If I look at the several delays in this project, it seems to me they all come from two sources. One is a lack of understanding of what others need and require, which results in false starts and restarts. The second is a genuine desire to advance the project, but also to be true to the internal checks and balances and procedures the organization has put in place to ensure whatever it needs to ensure. And these assurances and procedures differ by organization. They may be incompatible in time and in terms of content. I have no solution for this, and maybe it's not even a problem, but it does bring me to my final principle of the morning, and that is I really think we need to rethink what collaboration means and how we can simplify and streamline bringing together for-profit, not-for-profit, and governmental stakeholders to accomplish broadband goals. Maybe what we need is a position, a person with each grant, whose job it is to see that grant through. Big companies would have this. The Verizon have people whose job it is to track grants and to take care of all this stuff. But we don't want to deal only with large companies. We want the opportunity to deal with companies that are entrepreneurial, that are flexible, that want to move us forward in ways that we need to move forward. These companies will have problems finding such a position, so perhaps this is a solution. Perhaps not. It's just an idea. I know I am committed to support the efforts to bring broadband not just to southern Cayuga County, but to all of Cayuga County. There are not many things that are essential to our economic, social, and educational development as a community, but in my view, universal broadband is one of them, and I think we need to stay focused. So I want to thank you for your time. I think I did fine on time.
You did.
Great. So thank you very much.
And I should have been in his introduction said that he is not only a former professor and official at Community College, but he also is a member of the county legislature, and I did fail to mention that. Thank you for that presentation. We're now going to hear from Constance Evelyn, who, as I said at the beginning, was one of 3 people part of the governor's initiative last year, put together school education connections. So, Superintendent, thank you for getting here, because I know you drove a long way from out of town to be here. Thank you.
For those of you who love winter, this is your year. Very happy for all of you. And I'm just living through you vicariously. 5, I called, the hour delay, and at 6, it went on, and we're closed today. So thank you for asking me to discuss broadband with you this morning, and specifically the work with the commission, the governor's vision and proposal around the Smart Schools Bond Act, and I'll talk a little bit about how that will impact Auburn schools. So in April, I received a call from the governor's office to sit on the commission to take a look at the issues that schools are facing, public schools, around connectivity and access to digital resources. Of course, I answered the call because the board and I really do feel as though much of the work that I'm engaged in at the local and state levels have served Auburn students and the community well, and so I'll continue to engage in that work. On the committee with me was Jeffrey Canada, CEO and chair of Harlem Children's Zone, which is a charter school movement down in New York City, a very successful one, and Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google. We had 4 meetings in all, and heard from many critical stakeholder groups, parents, students, teachers, educators from across the board, other superintendents. David Salway came and presented a number of times. And that was really important to better understand what the needs are, first and foremost, facing public schools, and also to equally have a grasp about where is the disparity in New York State in terms of access to the internet. And there is a wide variety of there is a wide gap, I should say, in terms of where schools are relative to readiness for students to be able to access these resources. We had our meetings from Buffalo all the way to Long Island, so I have literally been driving all over the state in the last year. And so, in terms of the governor's proposal, I think this quote from him really sums it up. He really envisions transforming our classrooms from yesterday to today. And that specifically means that what can we do with connectivity that we couldn't do before? And so this is beyond, just projecting the notes that we would have used the overhead projector for onto the smart board, right? This is beyond just overlaying old practices using new technology. This is what could we dream about doing, right, in the past that we couldn't do without technology. Eileen, thank you very much. Eileen's going to move the slides forward. We appreciate you. I'm sorry, let me just step out from behind the podium because I can't really see this. So within again, the vision, there are 5 ways that we talked about improving education. Student engagement goes through the roof, particularly with the millennial generation, because this is the way they've learned all along. This is the way they've accessed information. Many of us who are in our generation are what we call digital immigrants. We've come along kicking and screaming. If we try to call our friends who are under 30 years old, they don't pick up the phone, but if we text them, we get a response immediately. When we grew up, we had a finite amount of information that we could access. The teacher taught us a few things. We could go to the library, go through the card catalog. Of course, our parents were there. And after that, we had church. We pretty much were all in. Now, information is infinite for students. And Constance, Long Island, in terms of increasing student engagement, saw this transformation when they passed out Chromebooks in 9th and 10th grade. 50% of their discipline went down in 9th grade, and that's significant at the high school level, because 9th grade is where we see, right, most of disciplinary problems across the state. It allows teachers to tailor curriculum and lessons to individual student needs. So this is beyond differentiation, right? We've been talking about differentiating instruction for a long time in public education, and that is good practice. But this is really differentiation 3.0. This is your ability. Access to technology and access to digitized resources really boosts your ability to customize learning for every individual student in the classroom and in the school. Extends learning outside the classroom to home. We had one superintendent come and present about his school district that was vast. I mean, it was 150 square miles. And students were on buses for over an hour regularly to and from school. And he created, by providing mobile learning devices to his students on the buses. And this gets back to your point about making sure that we have connectivity throughout our counties. He created rolling study halls, right? And students that did not have access to advanced material, AP material, now had access, and we were engaging bus drivers in that particular district as support. I thought that was a pretty innovative idea. We've talked about this a great deal in terms of access to technology, leveling the playing field by reducing economic and geographic disparities. The rural areas, again, are well behind because of economics in terms of access to these resources. And we're living in a state, unfortunately, where we have the most segregated schools probably in many, many states. I don't want to say in America because I don't want to exaggerate, but New York State is a very segregated state in terms of public schools relative to economics and to ethnicity. And there are trends along those lines that unfortunately persist. And this is a way of closing those gaps. And in terms of preparing students as job seekers in the 21st century, they absolutely are going to be required to have particular technical skills as they enter college and as they enter the workforce, depending on what their choices are. Many colleges are demanding and should be, right? Engaging students in online course opportunities, even though they're on campus. And so our students have to have that experience, or else they won't even really be able to navigate, right? Finding their way around the curricular and instructional materials. Eileen? So the uses, the parameters in terms of the smart bond money that were determined by the governor and staff include the purchase of technology equipment, including all the things that we currently see in our school districts around smart boards and computers, but also mobile learning devices such as Chromebooks, etc. The installation of the high-speed broadband and interconnectivity for schools and communities. For Auburn, this is a major lift. Right now, I would say that our infrastructure is at least 5 years behind in terms of being able to provide high-speed broadband in all of our schools, parking lots, and the communities. And because of that, it creates a barrier for us to be able to roll out Chromebooks, for example. I could hand out Chromebooks to all 9th graders today if we had the money, and none of them would work consistently, right? And so for Auburn and for many other districts, this piece, this internet connectivity is critical. Construction, enhancement, and modernization of facilities for pre-K programs, and some monies have been dedicated, or you can dedicate, I should say, some monies to high-tech security. Number 3 really, I think, was really focused on New York City. There were a lot of information coming out of New York City around the need for being able to provide facilities for pre-K programs downstate. And also number 4, although we would benefit, again, from more resources to put towards security in districts across the state. You know that keeping our children and families safe is our top priority, always. So as a result of the many hours that we met and the feedback that we heard from folks across New York State, we developed as a commission 7 keys to success. One, which seems rather obvious, but that we should expand online learning for a number of reasons, some of which I already mentioned, and others that are really student-centered. I remember being in Ithaca and walking into a classroom that we as a team had worked to develop a one-to-one environment in. And the teacher really had shifted her role from teacher to facilitator of learning to coach. And every child in the classroom had an iPad. And when I walked in, almost every child was working on something different that day. And I remember walking up to a young lady who was using an app that was focused on word origins. This is 4th grade. And so I started talking to her about why that app was important to her and why she was working within that app. And she said, well, of course I have to know word origins and Latin. I am on my way to Harvard. And I said, okay, that makes sense to me. Of course, silly me. I don't know why I asked you that. I must just be crazy. But anyway, so this is what I'm talking about in terms of customizing their own learning. And that does take a shift, right, in your thinking and in the way that you approach teaching and learning as an educator in the classroom. And that will require, I believe, much professional development. I think we really talked about number 2, and I've tried to give you some examples of that. In my work, again, on this commission, in my work generally speaking, I was able to visit many, many schools. And one of the schools that I visited in terms of number 3 and connecting to high-speed broadband, and how it really does transform the classroom. It allows you to do things that you would never dream that you could do before. A good example of this is when I walked into Mineola Middle School. And you may have seen the picture, we were all standing on the wall with our 3D glasses on. And when we walked in the room, it was a 7th grade science room, and they were doing a lesson on refraction and reflection. How many of you remember the lesson on refraction and reflection in 7th grade? I know you were really engaged in that, right? Anyway, so the teacher turns the lights off, and he presses the button, and the eyeball appears in the middle of the room after you put your 3D glasses on. So now the eyeball is floating in the middle of the room, sort of like a hologram. And you could reach out and touch it, literally. But what immediately came to mind for me in terms of college and career ready was how I could see through a 12-year-old's eyes exactly why I was learning what I was learning about refraction and reflection, and what it meant to my own body and how the human system works. And I immediately said to myself, you know, if I had seen this in 7th grade, I might have thought about whether or not I wanted to be an optometrist, right? And so when you have that kind of experience when you're a child, you're not just looking at curriculum instruction, you're thinking about what does this mean and how can I apply it? And that became immediately apparent to me when I was in the room that day. And then we've also talked about this transition from school to home, and that every student has sufficient connectivity. I remember that my son, one day, my son Kiro, he's 9 now, and he was about 7 and a half, and he's a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. He's never really upset about anything. And he was really upset this day because he was trying to create a Gmail account. This was right after they decided that you need to be 13 to have a Gmail account. I mean, and he was really not in a good way. And I said, what is it? Why do you need a Gmail account? Are you expecting mail? I don't get it, right? I mean, don't you talk to your friends when you go to school? And he said, no, I don't need the Gmail account. I'm not getting any mail. I need the Gmail account because I need a YouTube account, right? And I said, okay, talk to me about that a little bit. And he said, well, you know that I love sharks, and I've been researching sharks for the last 3 years, and I want to create a YouTube video about sharks. And I have a number of sources. You know, I've downloaded some video, I've edited, and now I want to recraft it and post it to YouTube. Because this is what their expectation is, the millennial generation. They take information from many different places, they reformat it, they recreate it, and then they want to share it with the world. And by the way, when they walk in our classrooms, they expect to be able to have that experience. Okay? So 5, 6, and 7, pretty much self-explanatory. The only thing I would say about 7 that we heard over and over again was to plan, plan, plan. Right? You can't decide that you're going to be a one-to-one district, have mobile learning devices for every child, and leave teachers behind. You can't decide to do that, and you don't have the infrastructure to support it. And so there are many moving parts to becoming more connected. And what does that mean for the learning environment for all, for educators and children? And so every step of the way, you have to communicate, plan, and replan. So for Auburn, the projected amount of money from the Smart Schools Bond Act is $3.5 million. I should say up to $3.5 million. And for us, primarily, that means that we would be able to engage in the $1.2 million projection project that we need to adopt. And it also means that we'd be able to engage in the probably $1.3 million infrastructure project that we need to move forward to develop in order to have connectivity across all 7 campuses. Okay?
The superintendent has addressed us on several occasions, but if you may remember, her first presentation to us was about her first budget several years ago, when we were up at North Fulton, or South Fulton, and she talked about infrastructure and the internet and wiring for schools back then. So thanks for being a leader on that. Our final speaker and presentation is about the governor's new proposal that he unveiled with several slides during his combined State of the State and budget presentation in January. It's an exciting initiative. I said this could be a real game changer. And so I'm not going to introduce you anymore. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Mr. Salway.
Thanks very much, guys. I think with the weather today that you were testing everybody's support to Broadband because everybody came out here for that. So it has to be a true testament to your support of that. I'm just going to go over, like I said, just to go over a little bit, provide some details on the governor's new New York program, which is the $500 million commitment. I want to just take a step back too and provide some background on some of the things that we have going on in addition to the funding program and sort of what led up to today as well for the state of broadband in New York State. Put it next slide. Thank you. Brief background of what my office does. We basically had a single point of contact for the state for broadband. We worked on several grant programs before the Governor's Connect New York grant program, which was the first one that he spoke a little bit about some of the projects that are underway in the area here. That was Connect New York, $25 million commitment. It was large at the time until we got the $500 million commitment, obviously, and it's in perspective, obviously, the new program is going to be much larger and much more expanded scope. The REDCs, the Regional Economic Development Councils that the governor set up several years ago during his first term, have been really key to what we've been able to do and extend the reach in what we do in terms of the collaboration aspect of it. It's very important. We have about 1,000 municipalities in upstate New York. Obviously, New York City is a little bit different the way things are set up down there, but the same concept. The needs of the region are very unique, and sometimes they extend beyond the borders of a particular region, but that collaborative effort is really enhanced when we're able to leverage a regional approach instead of having to look at each municipality individually. And that may mean some additional organization and some additional stakeholders need to come to the table. That's been a key success factor with Connect New York, as well as what we want to do with the new New York program as well. Talked about the grant programs already that we administered previously. We have a lot of partnerships on the local level, other state agencies that have a lot of impact on broadband. For example, the Public Service Commission, Department of Transportation with big ones. There's a lot of connections and a lot of interface that we have with various state agencies, the federal government as well. We want to make sure that we leverage federal grant programs, Connect Ed, E-Rate for schools in particular, that we want to make sure that we leverage everything that's available today when we roll out smart schools. And that's the same for the New York program as well. There's broadband grant programs, the Connect America Fund, for example, that we want to make sure that we leverage to the fullest extent as we roll out the state programs. And again, the outreach like we're doing today, but also making sure that we engage all the different groups that are out there, being advocates in the community for broadband, but also that have many projects that are underway and organized and ready to go forward. Next slide, please. A brief overview of where we are today in terms of broadband access. Our previous definition of broadband was 6 and 1.5, which was a couple megabits ahead of the FCC, which seemed like it was very large at the time because of where we were. But just in terms of the aspect of where we've come since then, it pales into comparison what we need today and what our goals are for New York. We know that the requirements are increasing, and I think it was Guy you said earlier about, one of the leaders said that they didn't want to go too far ahead with it because they're not sure what's going to happen in the future. And that, to an extent, is why we are building for today with the speed goals we have at 100 megabits per second, but also knowing that those speeds will be able to scale up to much larger speeds in the future. It's all pointing toward one technology. All providers use that. Fiber optics is obviously the technology we're talking about for several different provider types. I'll go into a little more details in just a few minutes. But again, it's building for what we need today for all our stakeholders, community anchor institutions, schools, and libraries, but also for the community as well for business and economic development. In terms of what we have at the speed, so when we go higher than 6 and 1.5, when we go up to 25 and 10, there's 5.4 million New Yorkers that don't have access at those speeds. And again, most of those are upstate. 100 megabits with a 10 megabit upload speed, we have 7 million New Yorkers and 113,000 businesses that don't have access. So again, the numbers get much higher as we go to the higher speeds. We know that the higher speeds are really what are driving our economic development in our communities. In addition to the speeds and the number without access at 100 megs, 70% of those without access are in upstate, with 2 counties not having any access whatsoever. So So you can see that there's a real need for access. Speeds, Keith, I think we spoke to some of the speeds in terms of being not just about access any longer. With electricity, rural electrification, there was one line into the home. Once that home was connected to electricity, you were set. There was not much upgrades in terms of what you would need. It's not like that with broadband. Today, you could have a DSL connection, a slower speed connection. That's not adequate any longer. We have to have those higher speeds, and we need more capacity to do the things that we do. Just Dr. Evelyn, in terms of what she said about the teenagers and using the access. I was in New York City last week, and it was Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer was saying, if I want my daughter, teenage daughter, to clean up her room, I can't just go in there and tell her. It takes 15 minutes for her to even acknowledge it. You text her, and they're on the phone, she's in there in 2 seconds. So that's the way you communicate now. That's the way kids engage in there. And for good or bad, sometimes you'd rather have them respond to you in person out there, but it's an electronic age, and that's been built into part of how they learn today and how they respond. Next slide, please. This is the map that I promised earlier. In terms of maps, are always a good way to punctuate what we're talking about. This isn't the yellow and blue map, but this is the map that just gives you a sense for some of the impact we've had with some of the previous projects. Just to give you, the color key here, these are the lower speeds. This is the 6, 1.5. Those that have the blue have those lower speeds. And the areas that you see in white out there are all the areas that have no access whatsoever, not even at the 6 and 1.5 speed. So it just gives you a sense for where we need to fill in the gaps and where we need to actually raise the speeds as well to make sure that they meet today's needs. The color-coded areas you see there are the broadband projects we have underway through the regional council funding as well as through Connect New York. Next, please. The goal of the New York program, again, it's a $1 billion program in total. It's $500 million from state funding with a 1-to-1 match. That 1-to-1 match is overall for the program. We know that the matching commitments for some communities, it's more expensive to build out. The demographics and the business case don't make sense for providers to build out because of the economics. And the whole key to the program is to complete that business case, to make that equitable, to make that profitable for the provider to actually build out in those areas. And we know by various factors how much it costs, what the demographics are, what the revenue per user, for example, and not to get into too much detail. We know what the economics are, and we know that point where the provider will say, I can't invest here because I couldn't sustain my business, or I need an incentive to actually build out here to do that. And that's the real premise of the program, is to complete that financial picture so they're able to build out there and extend access in the community. Again, the governor's goal is very, very ambitious, very bold, but it's achievable. We know we can do it. We know we can do it with the partnerships we've already had in place and the ones that we're forming as a result of this as well. The goal is to have high-speed internet access at the 100 meg speed tier for most communities in New York State by 2019, the end of the governor's second term. Again, this is the largest and most ambitious broadband commitment in the entire nation. What we're going to be doing in terms of some of the other areas where it's not feasible to build out necessarily a wireline connection at the 100 meg speeds is some of the partnerships we've had. I think Clarity Connect is probably a good example of that. It's just not feasible to connect fiber to the mountain, the house at the top of a hill, maybe in the Adirondacks, some very remote cases like that. And that's where maybe a fixed wireless solution may come into play, where we can extend the reach of the existing wireline networks. Next slide, please. Private sector partnerships have been a key with Connect New York, will be definitely a key with what we do with New York. The 1-to-1 match, again, is overall for the program. It's not for the entire program. We also know that a lot of the policy barriers that are in place are a piece of that economic picture for the providers to build out. And often the only barrier, actually, that prevents them from building out. What I mean by that is some of the access to rights of way, for example, poles, which is a big issue with a lot of providers, utility poles. A lot of communities have access or can manage some of that risk for the provider. And those are the type of things that we're trying to leverage with New York as well. The other key piece of policy in terms of New York is the access to state infrastructure. And again, the New York State Thruway, the Northway, there are 500 miles of fiber that's available up and down the Northway and the Thruway that is very underutilized. We open that up and make it easier for providers to access infrastructure like that, rights of way, conduits, for example. We have a lot of assets that are not on the table today that we can really leverage to build this out and extend the reach. So that's a big proponent, that's a big key to the program as well, in addition to the funding. Next, please. The speeds are unprecedented again, and I mentioned earlier, sometimes we don't, if you look at it and you choose the technology, it can be perceived as, picking winners and losers. But if you look at all the types of providers we have today, DSL providers, even wireless, cable providers, it's increasingly moving over to a fiber-based network. And it's either a hybrid network where maybe a cable connection completes that in the home, in the premise, but fiber is the only technology that really extends the reach. It's basically the speed of light, so you're moving back and forth as quickly as you can, and it actually provides the speeds that we're seeking. Other technologies can provide those speeds, but they're typically built with a fiber-based network as you build out. The regional councils are a key place of our planning as they work with Connect New York. We have increased access to mapping data as well, so providing the regional councils with the information they need to plan projects to make that easier for a broadband provider to actually propose a project is really what we're achieving with this. And again, I mentioned a little bit earlier about the leveraging of state-owned fiber and other assets as well. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Okay, I have your yellow map over there we can put up later, okay? One of the other areas I know that we were looking at too, and this is where the PSC also comes in, is the make-ready process, which again, we don't have to get too deep into some of the details, but the make-ready process involves, looking at how many poles are involved with this project, walking and deciding where that actual fiber line or connection is going to go on the pole. That's a very time-intensive, resource-intensive, and costly endeavor for the providers. And the idea behind this piece is to make that easier as well by providing the data, first of all, which would seem like a very basic request, but providing the data to be able to plan the projects, but also facilitate the access to that infrastructure as projects are being built out. And part of what we're doing to facilitate that is setting up a web-based problem resolution center as well as an information portal that provides real-time access to that type of data. Where are those poles? Planning projects and being able to carve out a service area and determine how many poles are in that service area, what are the demographics in there, what does the business case look like, things like that that are very time intensive and sometimes the only barrier for a provider to actually decide to build out in a particular area. Again, also to resolve any issues related to the administrative side, also on the policy side as well, if there's an issue with access to a particular pole or a problem with receiving funding from a particular source. And again, the documentation is key as well to be able to plan those projects. Next slide, please. The other piece that we talked about earlier was the adoption aspect. And this goes to both the public policy perspective, being a good public policy, but also from the provider, being an incentive for a provider. If there's no customers after a project is built out, that's often a deterrent for building out into other areas. And what I mean by that is there's access available, but the means to subscribe to that access is out of reach for a lot of the people in that service area through either affordability, not being able to afford the connection, not knowing how to use the connection, digital literacy, or not perceiving that there's a need to have that. And that's a result of more outreach and more education that goes out. Part of the New York program, but also a parallel effort entirely, is iLink New York, which is an adoption program that is a partnership with providers, device manufacturers. Dr. Evelyn said earlier about having Chromebooks that she could use today. Having those available and having the training that goes along with them. And by the way, the students often make the best teachers, as we heard in the Smart Schools meetings as well, because they use the technology day in and day out. So we can leverage that as well and get them more invested into the process. And again, the idea is to provide devices to those that can't afford it or the means aren't there to be able to afford that, the affordable access to the internet, as well as the education behind that in terms of the digital literacy as well. So again, 3 key pillars of making sure that we have all that when we roll out the infrastructure. I won't go into this. Dr. Evelyn did a great job going through all this already and inside and out. But the key piece that I want to take away from this is that we're not doing this independently of one another. We have 2 very, very critical programs, a very school-centric broadband connectivity, technology-driven program through the Smart Schools Bond Act. And we have New York, which is an infrastructure-based broadband program. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that as infrastructure is being built out to our community anchor institutions like schools and libraries, that we leverage those connections. A lot of times, for example, E-Rate was a very technology-driven school internet connectivity program, which was very successful in achieving what it set out to do. But what happened oftentimes was that the schools could only use that very specifically for access to schools. And providers weren't always interested in doing that because it bypassed areas that could have made that a very profitable picture to them. Even if it was being reimbursed for the extension to the schools, they weren't able to kind of harness some of that by leveraging other connections to the community. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that this is going to be very school focused, obviously, but if we do this in collaboration with the New York program and look at the whole picture, the whole service area where those schools are, we can increase the connection, increase the service areas, expand them outward from the schools. The other thing we know as well, as we heard earlier too, was that learning and teaching doesn't just occur in the classrooms any longer. It's outside of the classrooms. You know, having access in buses and so forth are important, but also making sure that the children have the devices at home to be able to access their homework online. So it's beyond just having access, particularly in the school building. It's outside the school building as well. So both of these programs really are designed to work together, work in tandem. They took you through some of the high level in terms of what we're achieving or trying to achieve with New York. It's obviously this is what you call the budget process now. I like that analogy.
Big ugly.
The big ugly sounds like that's kind of a description for this time of the year, just because it's a lot of things going on at once in terms of what's going on with the budget. Once the budget passes, we'll be able to roll out much more detailed information in terms of the program and how to apply for it. The goals of this program too that I didn't mention was to roll out the funding very quickly. And previous processes were driven because of necessity through an RFP-based grant process. We're really looking at different, some innovative ways that we can both speed that up, but also make it so it's more of a reimbursement process instead of tell us what you want to serve, we'll look at the grant, we'll evaluate it, and kind of look and see which one's the best. We want to be able to evaluate it based on the factors I was mentioning earlier and get the funding flowing where we know what those problems are. We have a tremendous amount of data. We want to harness that, so we make sure we put that into the funding process to move things along quickly. So with that, I'll wrap up.